On right now. Hello, everyone. I'm the Albion, and I'm joined today with Rupert.
Hello.
With Freelance.
Hi.
The Bloke.
Hello.
And Brandig.
Good afternoon.
And what better way to cap off our discussion yesterday of Animal Farm than looking at something else by Orwell, Notes on Nationalism. I've put in the link underneath the way of reading it online. But who wants to give the basic premise of the essay? Okay, well, I will do that then. I think this essay, the small summary of the essay would be that Orwell is trying to sum up what he views as a difference between patriotism and nationalism, his issues that he has with nationalism, and then some examples that he puts throughout the essay of the way he categorizes it as being positive nationalism, transferred nationalism, and negative nationalism. To begin with, are there any starting points, or do you want me to just go through his the ways in which he defines nationalism?
Well, I think it's prudent to start with the fact that he defines nationalism different than we do it nowadays.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the three main points in which he uses to categorize the term nationalism are obsession, instability, and indifference to reality. Obsession, the way he uses it is that nationalism doesn't have to be a nation. Nationalism can be towards anything. It can be towards a nation, an idea, a race, any sort of concept. The way that he's using it, I think, is more accurately described now as something like ideology. So with obsession, he's describing it as being the person that is having nationalistic feelings is obsessive over the subject and is constantly claiming superiority over other areas that are in conflict with their nationalism. Instability is the way he described it as a flippancy of the intelligentsia, in which they're anyone that's thoroughly imbued with a nationalistic attitude is very quick to flip from one ideology to another, or one nationalism to another. The example he uses is the communists and fascists with trade places. And indifference to reality is the summary that I have of it is it's okay when my side does it. So do we think that's a fair representation? And do we think it's accurate to how we consider nationalism now?
So I think nationalism is pretty much the wrong way of approaching this, though. To me, the reason why he's going with the term nationalism is because it's a reference to, I suppose it's a reference to the actual the core of the term in terms of a nation as a people. But the people that he's describing, or that is being perceived by the people who fulfill this category of nationalism or fit into this category of nationalism, are more like a subjective or sort of self-placing sort of sense of people. So the people in question could be just an ideological grouping, and that they are the in almost like a Manichaean sense, they are the good, and those that oppose them are the evil. And I think that's kind of the angle that he's coming at it from. Though probably something more like tribalism would be a better description to me.
It might be because before the Second World War, you didn't have this except for things like the British Empire, which were still bound to a certain nation. You didn't have this globalist kind of structure where you had ideologies which would span a lot of nations, and maybe the only exception at the time was communism, which he does mention. But it still seems like that all these ideologies are still projected onto nations, and that's why he calls it nationalism.
Yeah, the expansion of the tribe to include the nation is one of the first things that's done by any conquering king or noble who wants to create subjects out of an entire regional area. He establishes a national identity that he can then use to bind his people together under one banner and use that as a club against the neighboring tribes. To Rupert's point, tribalism is an excellent way of establishing it in the natural order of things. But one of the core elements of nationalism, to my mind, and this is addressed by Orwell in his writing, is that it is not ideological at its core. It is geographical primarily. And that's where he slips into the recharacterization of nationalism as basically ideologues, both for an ideology or against an ideology. And he then transfers the nationalistic identity into an ideology. So you are now no longer British. You are a member of the United Kingdom. You are now no longer a New Yorker. You are an American.
Yes, I don't know if this was the generally accepted term at the time. From reading the essay, he does say that there's misuse of the word nationalism in 1945. So just to make everyone aware, this was released in 1945. So I think there's language games being played from a man who is very experienced at describing language games. I think that there's a certain amount of altering of language to frame any form of nationalism as this sort of tribal instinct in a very negative light. And because obviously, if you're saying that you're anti this tribal nationalism, then what are you in favour of?
He does state that he chooses it for lack of a better word. But it does basically sort of trap him in, I think, into trying to make everything fit into that. If he hadn't gone down the route of using nationalism, I think he would have come to some greater level of understanding of what he was actually dealing with.
Yes, yeah,
and it would be remiss of us not to point out that he addresses that point head on, and like the immediate first couple sentences of the essay. That he says, I'm redefining nationalism to mean X, Y, and Z rather than its current colloquial use, which to my mind is a way for him to reappropriate a word in common usage and divert it to serve his purposes rather than invent a new word and make the effort to get it accepted amongst the general people.
It does have a kind of subversive element to it.
Yeah, it's a frame game that he's playing with it. I mean, he's in some ways he's upfront with it, but like I say, if you're using nationalism to represent what he's describing, then obviously he's putting it in quite a negative light. So what is he in favour of? Something that is not nationalism, something that may be described as internationalism, or something that may be described as individualism,
well,
whatever it may be.
He implies, he does make some allusion to what he's sort of in favour of later on, in that he wants people to be more sort of reasoned and less dogmatic in their approaches to things, which kind of sounds noble enough, but I suppose the issue is that it's very difficult to actually maintain some kind of like coherent structure of action, I suppose, that can sustain that, because especially when you're talking about like large nation level propagandistic efforts, of which he would have been very acutely aware, being that the Second World War was ongoing. It's very difficult to maintain the sort of momentum and the morale of troops in particular when you're asking them to die for a constantly shifting story. So if they can't stay, if the Allies and the British in general can't stay on one particular story, even if it's perhaps incorrect, and get people to die for Britain itself, just as an entity without having to demonstrate to them in a reasoned sense why they should die, you can't really wage a war like that. You're going to see a lot of defections. You're going to see a lot of desertions, and I don't see how he can't have connected the dots, being that he'd experienced some of this himself. Like, he himself was a very poor example of a soldier after his experiences in Catalonia, because he sort of had this turning on his own cause, and so the fact that he doesn't seem to apply that is quite interesting.
Is it fair to say that he had a turning on his own cause? Because I'm fairly certain the Stalinists turned on them in Catalonia, his branch in Catalonia, and
I mean, in a certain sense, but he wasn't willing to sort of go down with the cause in that regard.
It seems to me that he's trying to characterize the nationalistic tendencies, and he spends some not insignificant amount of time in the essay describing this as a set of double standards, and he seems to be advocating for universal standards. If you're going to condemn an action, that action should be condemned irrespective of whether it's done by our group or the other group. And he points out several obvious contradictions when individuals in power in one group cheer for a particular action when it is done by their side, but condemn it when it is done by the quote-unquote other side.
It's that people act like they have principles, or say that they have principles, but when they act, they just are purely tribal. And they will rationalize all the atrocities that they are doing, saying, well, if we do it, then it's justified. And if they do it, then it's a war crime. So
to put it in a slightly more charitable framing, people will be more likely to give the benefit of the doubt to their own side as well. I mean, when we're talking about atrocities, slaughtering hundreds of people, the benefit of the doubt may not be the best term to describe it, but for that, you're always going to prefer to give a benefit of the doubt to who you feel is your own side.
Yeah, well, what he actually describes is that people will reject proof that goes against their side, but will happily accept just really weak proof that goes against the other side. So what happens is that they are willing to accept a plausible story why this happened, like they were forced. While if you would tell it about the opponent, they would say, well, they still had, they will make an excuse that they still had ability to change their mind. So there's really this thing going on that Jonathan Haidt says in The Righteous Mind, that morality binds and blinds, and that people just filter information that's coming in to fit with their story, their morality that they've constructed.
It's the classic perspective of motivated reasoning.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's kind of where I was going to take it as well, insofar as it seems like in a lot of ways he's kind of arguing against humanity, because we're just sort of programmed to filter information in this way to act as coherent groups. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
So
yes,
so it's kind of like
I see what you mean.
Yeah, so it's like a false.
There's this sort of rationalist attitude towards it, it's hard
that comports very well with his perspective as a true socialist and an idealistic socialist who was more of a Trotskyist than a Stalinist.
Yeah, well, he's also a humanitarian atheist, where I think that he envisions a socialist world. He is idealistic, but he does at least know how to criticize effectively. But as you say, a lot of those criticisms that he has are fundamental elements of being human. So it can be, I can understand the criticisms, and I think that there's a balanced perspective where we must understand that this is the thought process we go through. And he does finish the essay off with this point where he says that even though we may be subject to these nationalistic thoughts, we can at least be aware of them in ourselves to understand that it may influence our decision making, which I think is a fair note to finish on.
It's something we should be aware of, that it exists, and also accept that it exists, so that we don't try to eradicate it. Because if you
Yes.
try to do that, then you will either erase a part of humanity, or you actually will fail, and then you fall. You'll end up in thinking that we are the good guys and they are the bad guys, instead of seeing everything more in shades of gray.
Yes.
Well, it's kind of difficult to sustain a civilization on shades of grey as well, because you kind of have to have that collective will. You have to have the sense that you are a like a chosen people almost in a lot of cases, to stand up to severely adverse odds. Let's say in a lot of cases.
It's not easy, but it takes a lot of effort to do. But you have to realize that in the end, you are merely human, and you are flawed. So you saying, well, we are the chosen people, is already saying like, okay, we are righteous and anything we do can be justified.
Well,
So
I
think you need that. Otherwise, you're going to get kind of trampled on the civilizational scale by someone else who does.
The problem is indeed that somebody else will have this narrative and will use that against you.
But that's not a weakness, that's a strength.
Yeah, because if they have that narrative, they're going to outperform you. I think this is the difference between understanding things on an individual basis and understanding that as a collective, there needs to be certain assumptions that have to be made to effectively cooperate.
Well, I would contend that the nebulous is actually a better rallying point for a society than the concrete, because once the nebulous becomes concrete, people can fail to adhere to the concrete realities or the concrete measures used for quote unquote moral action. But if the national ideal remains this nebulous us, then everyone can be justified in whatever action it is that they choose, as long as they fall back on, well, it was us versus them, which is one of the core classical arguments of consequentialism.
I mean, that might be the reality, that it is an us versus them, but it probably wouldn't. It would probably be very seldom put in those kinds of terms.
Undoubtedly, it's never called that. There's always the trappings of morality, etc. But if we look past the window dressing, it's fundamentally reallocating and rejustifying things when it's to our benefit and condemning them when it's not.
I think to maybe illustrate the point with an example, or to illustrate sort of why some of this is necessary, the Holy Crusade angle is not too far from what the propaganda was saying in the US in World War II, in the sort of Pacific theater. But the same sort of thing applied in the Vietnam War, where I mean the same sort of strategy applies to the Asian power in both cases, that they were trying to make the war so costly that America wouldn't really want to be involved in it anymore. But it worked in the Vietnamese case because Americans themselves were more willing to, or at least the institutions at large were more willing to broach this topic, I suppose, of like, should we be doing certain things, and like, is it okay how we're conducting this war, and all of that kind of thing. Whereas in the Japanese sense, in the Japanese case, it was more of just, we're in this holy crusade, and basically anything that we do is right by definition, and anything that they do is evil by definition.
Well, if you're on the battlefield and the enemy has a friend-enemy distinction, and everyone on your side is looking at it as an individualistic exercise, then you're automatically at a disadvantage.
Right.
And when we're not at war, at whatever level that may be, then yes, we can discuss things on this individualistic level. But for collective action, there must be, as you say, Brandig, a nebulous that can hold everyone together, even if it is just the assumption that it's an us and them conflict. Anyway, I think we've spoken about our issues that we have with his definitions, but he does explain it in the essay, so we can't bash him too much for that. I mentioned at the very beginning how he defines it. We've covered indifference to reality a fair amount. Do you have anything to say about the instability? I found it to be the most poorly phrased title heading for any of his pieces, because I don't exactly think it's instability. I think it's more disloyalty to an idea and more to the thought process, I suppose.
Well, it comes across more as like a psychological trait of the kind of people who are exploring these kinds of ideas.
Yeah.
So he's talking mainly in this sort of ideological space, in this very sort of abstract space of obscure ideologies or even some mass ideologies. But the people who are attracted to these tend to be people who are more inclined, I suppose, to be unstable in their sort of mental workings. I think that comes through in Haidt's work and elsewhere in some other places on sort of personality traits and how that affects people's thinking and people's mooring to certain ideas. Is that there's much more likelihood for them to sort of jump between different ideologies when one or other sort of premises that was sort of foundational to their worldview is either shifted or their value judgment changes on it, so they can completely turn on I don't know, for example, whether or not the national level is a worthwhile sort of frame to pay attention to, or the way that the working class self-identify, for example, because that was one of the main distinctions between sort of more fascist-leaning syndicalism and more communist-leaning syndicalism in France, which then sort of spread over to Italy in the 20s and 30s, or maybe even a little bit earlier as well, with people like Mussolini. Because when they start paying attention to that angle of, I mean, there's a few other things that go into it, but paying attention to what the national workers actually want, then you kind of get more into spaces of fascism rather than the international syndicalism that became much more closely associated with communism.
Or in his mind, Trotskyism. Because he quite frequently throughout this and in other works really tries to hammer home the point that there's a distinction between Trotskyists or ites, I never quite remember the difference, and the communists.
Well, I mean, according to what he said in the matter, it could be more accurately be described as pro-Soviet Union, or like as is, communists and anti-Soviet Union communists.
Yeah,
but the same could apply anywhere. So you could have plenty of British fascists who were either pro-Hitler or anti-Hitler.
But
I think
he would
he's
make that distinction. Sorry, carry on, Brad.
I was just going to suggest that he might be characterizing the psychological condition of external identification. So people are defining their identity based upon an external set of ideas, and the reasons behind which set of ideals they pick is the least common part or the least concrete part of their personality. Merely that they are adhering to a specific set of ideals, and which specific set of ideals to which they're adhering is malleable. So if for whatever reason one were capable of punching a few holes in the ideology to which they currently ascribed, it would be completely consistent with their personality to switch that ideology to something that may very well be exactly opposite, because that competing ideology was the one that just destroyed or eliminated the previous ideology, and that is to what they now feel adherence.
I think it's interesting that he mentions the Europe fascist movements are largely recruited from communists, and he suspects the opposite may happen in the future, but I don't know how well that went.
Well, yeah, East Germany, the East German state apparatus was largely recruited from apparatus of the former regime in the same region.
Yeah, I suppose I was thinking. Yeah, I mean that was just like a shift of who's in control, but you still need people to operate the machines, and so you use the people that have previously operated it.
Same thing
But
happened.
During. I wanted to say it's interesting this idea. I'm just imagining like Antifa, tracking down Nazis to recruit them into their cause. That's where my mind went with it.
Yeah, I don't think it quite happens in that sort of frame, but it's more to do with trying to convince somebody on one or two issues, probably, or perhaps even just like grabbing people with promises of sort of non-ideological or non-political benefits, like some sense of belonging, or even just to be part of a movement that's actually going somewhere. You kind of see that. I feel like you do see that a lot when a movement gets a little bit of momentum, and then a lot of people jump on that may not necessarily be entirely ideologically aligned, but they kind of want to be part of this bigger thing for other reasons.
And they're part of the type, like the type of person that would join, those movements.
Fair weather fans, bandwagon jumpers, etc.
Yeah.
Also, people who are not happy with the previous regime, but they're still working for them. Those are prime people to recruit because they know how to operate the system already.
Right. I didn't necessarily want to lean on that, but that is a big component of support for a lot of these different extreme ideologies. Is especially when it comes to actually the business of actually governing. It comes also from people who just hate the sort of incumbent and want to create some opportunities for movement, or just sort of see whatever other movement is coming along as slightly more favorable to their own worldview. I mean, I'm thinking particularly of the people who were nostalgic for the imperial era in Weimar, and just they weren't on board with a lot of the sort of more modernist and urban leanings of the National Socialists, but they were kind of willing enough to get on board that the National Socialists managed to get some momentum behind them.
That's why you have frequent purges. Try and get rid of that possibility. And you're not leaving someone in office long enough for them to find a reason to dislike it, or to be good enough to know how to fight against it. Anyway, let's get back onto the essay on the subject of how he categorizes the three different types of nationalism. You have positive nationalism, transferred, and negative. And he does say himself that there can be combinations between all three of them. But in the most simple terms, a positive nationalism is when the feeling of that movement or idea is mainly focused in a positive direction. So it is the examples he uses, neo-Tories who after the war believe that the power of the empire has not shrunk, so it's less of a negative attitude towards the outsider and more of a positive one for the in-group. Transferred is most interesting one, I think, where it is the nationalistic tendencies that have moved from the in-group to an out-group, and then negative is reverse positive. It's when the outsider is the main focus of their nationalism. So it's more of a hatred than a love of the in-group.
In some of the examples that he uses, I find it kind of interesting in light of sort of other or more research that's been done on some of the topics, because in particular he spends a lot of time sort of attacking Chesterton for his pro sort of Catholic country bias.
Yes.
But one thing that particularly stuck out was his assessment that because Chesterton was pointing out that the French army was sort of stronger than the German army, therefore, he's just kind of like leaning on a bias there, and he's not really paying attention to reality. Whereas I think that Orwell is actually wrong on this, where he seems to sort of assume that because France lost in that scenario, therefore they had the weaker army, which is not necessarily the case, and I would very strongly argue was not the case. But that Germany, in a bunch of ways, got very lucky, and France got very unlucky, because, I mean, the Big Age himself was very willing to admit that if France had actually reacted to any of their earlier provocations in particular, then Germany would have been done for.
He cast a lot of shade on my man Chesterton, which I was not a fan of.
Yeah.
He accuses him of xenophilia, essentially, saying that he would never describe England in the same way as he described France. And yeah, as you say, I think Chesterton was just describing fact.
In most of the places that Orwell points out, yeah, I think he was. But also that, I mean, he couldn't quite know this because it comes very much more after his time. But I think later events somewhat show that the British Empire was very much still a viable entity until America kind of forcibly put it down, in combination with the sort of internal desire, I suppose, and the internal elite push to dissolve it. Because I mean, most of the areas, so like no strategic nodes had been removed from it. It was just the sort of the pure financial aspect. So if America hadn't been willing to kind of use that as a weapon against us, then there was no reason why it couldn't have continued. But they did, so it fell.
Well,
You're right.
when you're talking about comparative value of societies or armies or what have you, it's all based upon the metrics one uses for comparison. So it's the American versus the British international hegemony, if you will, is something that is capable of being analyzed on so many different metrics that would yield so many different distinct and discrete comparators and relationships that it's fundamentally can tell you anything, which is one of the main reasons why I think Orwell uses it or uses the idea of nationalism and nationalistic superlatives or derogatories to characterize the core beliefs, because as long as one keeps the comparators nebulous enough, one is fully justified in taking whatever position they want. It's analyzing it back down to the discrete, number of troops under arms, for example, with the Germans versus the French. You can actually come to a discrete number, but who was the better army? History shows that the Germans went through the French like crap through a goose. They may have had a ton of different externalities that worked together to allow for that, but that doesn't change the fact and the result. So as a consequence of that, one has to say historically, the Germans were a better army at the time than the French because the Germans beat the French. So taking that to the back to nationalism, if one can use any number of metrics, one can pick and choose the metrics they want to use to be pro or against any nationalistic party in the world.
Yes, and I think one of the other points he raises is that people will have several metrics, and as soon as one fails, they can fall back onto the next one underneath that to instead of changing their mind, just to confirm further that they're correct. Sorry, Karen.
Sorry, I was just going to say that framing still doesn't really work for me, because it's still it seems like it's coming down still on the line of it happened, therefore it necessarily had to happen. Whereas, obviously we can't run this experiment, but if you run the Germany v France, 1936 to 1941 or whatever, over and over again, like 100 times, then you probably don't get you don't get Germany winning probably a majority of times, because a lot of things just kind of like went in their way with complete happenstance events that meant that they came out on top when on paper they shouldn't have.
But so how do you know that those happenstance events weren't events that were taken advantage of by the Germans, that they didn't recognize that, hey, we have an opportunity here, and if we don't take advantage of this opportunity, we are going to be screwed?
Because oftentimes the things that turned out in their favor were in complete contradiction to orders.
Okay. So
the German high command was ordering one thing, and the commander himself ordered something entirely different.
Okay.
But it just happened to work in their favor, and the person,
because the commander on the ground at the time took a look at the tactical situation, not necessarily the strategic situation, and made a decision based upon the tactical factors at hand, and disregarded the orders of his superiors. And his superiors, being intelligent, strategic individuals that they were, recognized that the commander on the ground in the tactical situation in which he found himself did what he should have done and was correct in disregarding their orders.
I
Or
think he just,
politically put in a corner that they had to admit that.
I think they just got lucky. This is just afterwards biasing yourself, saying, "Oh, but they won, and therefore they must have been competent."
Right,
All I'm suggesting is there's no way for us to, after the fact, look at whether A caused B or B caused A.
I mean, you could go back. You can go down to the individual decisions, and you can like see all the orders that are being made. You can see sort of why all the different orders are being made, and you can see people who are responding to that not because of any stimuli that's taking place right in front of them, as a la the tactical situation that you're mentioning, but more because they were doing something for, for example, it was ordered that the Panzer divisions were going to come under. This is going to get like very nitty gritty, but it was ordered that the Panzer divisions were going to be brought under the jurisdiction of the infantry commanders effectively once the infantry divisions caught up to them, and so that created the situation where, in order to stay sort of glory seeking and take as much of the prestige for themselves as possible, the Panzer divisions raced off ahead and extended their logistical lines basically as far as they could possibly go, so that they could maintain independence basically and not have to answer to the infantry commanders who would take all the glory. That is something that is very, very, very easy to punish, but the French just didn't for a handful of command reasons that are basically arbitrary. Like commanders just sort of not giving certain orders and not. It comes down to something as silly as like a courier not leaving until the next day or a few hours too late, and that kind of makes the difference between whether a Panzer division in northern France gets through the lines or is cut off, surrounded, and destroyed.
That also makes the difference between whether Normandy got a division of tanks reinforcing it or not. Hitler slept in. That's one of the things that stopped reinforcements from moving. Again, all of this goes back to, we live in a world with discrete results, and I'm not going to gainsay the world in which we live, because fundamentally, all of this theory is just that theory. When you fight a battle, you are going to get a single discrete conclusion.
When you have an election, will you get a single discrete conclusion?
Yes. And that single discrete conclusion, and that single discrete conclusion may or may not have any reflection whatsoever in the actual will of the people as expressed through the election. But there will be a single discrete conclusion.
But that doesn't necessarily mean that they were the better. That they were the better entity in this.
That was the point I was trying to make. Yeah.
Better when defined as the ones that won, because all of this is after a certain objective. Which again, I think we're going far tangent from the essay at hand.
Definitely.
But but to circle it back to Orwell's Notes on Nationalism. This is a set of standards that can be used and applied discreetly, and saying the victor was the better at the competition. That's why sports teams play best of series, so that they can hopefully mitigate and minimize the random noise from any statistical set of data. There you go. Jonathan's absolutely right. Things discreetly resolve to, did he get shot or did he not get shot? When he got shot, was it lethal or was it not lethal? There have been people who've been shot in the same place, fundamentally from a physiological, biological perspective. Some people survive, some people don't.
If I drop my gun and it goes off and hits an enemy soldier, that doesn't make me the better shot automatically.
No, it makes you lucky.
Yeah.
Which is, in a lot of places, if you talk to most military commanders, even better than being a good shot. A lot of people would rather be lucky.
Napoleon selected his generals or hoped that he would be lucky. They didn't need to be good. They just need to have tremendous amount of luck. That was good enough.
And even going so far as you're dropping the gun analogy, if I drop my gun, there are 359 other degrees in which I could have dropped it that wouldn't hit that guy. So part of the dropping of the gun was, at least I dropped it in the right direction. which
So another
gave the
part of the essay
opportunity.
that I like.
Essay?
I was half tempted not to interrupt it, but let's try and bring it back on.
Probably should.
I was enjoying that.
I was, yes, but I know Brandig has got limited time, and I don't want all of it to be spent on that. Let's go on to the transfer to make sure we cover it before you leave, Brandig, because to me, I think that is currently the most visible that we see in the West today, particularly the one that he brands color feeling. There's a very interesting passages in that. So the transferred nationalism that he describes is when typically the intelligentsia swap from having their nationalistic feelings towards what would be considered the in-group to what would be the out-group. So for color feeling, it is when the intelligentsia swap from having any sort of quote-unquote white supremacy to believing that non-whites are superior. And the quote that I've pulled out that he uses is fantastic. Bearing in mind this was written in 1945, almost any English intellectual would be scandalized by the claim that the white races are superior to the colored, whereas the opposite claim would seem to him unexceptional, even if he disagreed with it.
I was surprised how appropriate that was to
Yes. Today. Now, if the BBC want to have any quote behind a statue, maybe they should put that one up.
Well, one of the great things about the transferable nationality or nationalism is it's eminently non-falsifiable. So one can take it as a given and an absolute, but to Rupert's point about the French being the better army, or but not having triumphed in this particular set of circumstances in this reality, one can game the conflict between the two, and one can take the side of the underdog or the other and be in a position to defend oneself using any number of rhetorical methodologies they like, and still hold the high ground, as they don't live in a world where that's the truth. So it's non-falsifiable. It can't be disproven.
Well, yeah. So this is why people don't like to talk often in terms of counterfactuals, despite our having done so for a little while prior. But I think the thing about that case in particular, the white supremacy versus black supremacy thing, is that it comes across even earlier than that. I don't think it's necessarily so much of a new phenomenon, but there's probably a distinction to be drawn, because in some cases it's a change in some premise or like a reevaluation of some premise or something like that causes a complete shift. Because again, some people are thinking about this in terms of like like a logical set of premises that lead to a conclusion. But in other cases, it's just a change in the value judgment, and nothing about the actual line of argument has changed. So if you talk about left imperialism versus right imperialism in the British Empire in the 19th century, then the arguments change from we need to rule over these people so that we can bring them up to civilization, versus we ought to rule them, or ought to be able to rule them because we're stronger. There's no necessary change. Like the case in both arguments is they are uncivilized, therefore we should rule them. But all that's changed is the sort of level of I guess what you do with that as a conclusion. And I think the same probably goes in a lot of cases for the white supremacy versus black supremacy thing. It's been pointed out a few other times, but a lot of the so you'll see in arguments, less so now, but it used to be a common talking point that diversity is our strength in the West, but over in the Middle East, diversity is their weakness, and that they're unstable countries because there are just completely arbitrary borders drawn that bear no resemblance to the actual groups on the ground and all of their sort of ethnic relations. Well, implicit in that is the fact that we are superior, therefore we can handle diversity and we can turn it into a strength, whereas for them, they're less developed, so obviously it's going to be more of a weakness for them.
Implicit to you.
I mean, you get the same people making this argument, so maybe they're just not thinking about it, and maybe they're just maybe it's an unquestioned two sets of arguments that are completely contradictory, and they're not observing them. But
I was almost saying that there's a level of doublethink in there.
Perhaps
because you're saying, well, they are different, so they have different. We should apply a different standard to them because of this reason. Why is this actually true? Is this really what is happening? And the other thing that you were describing and about exporting civilization, which was a thing which was done during the British Empire, it feels a lot like the way that the US has been exporting freedom to other countries as a pretext to invade, to justify what they were doing.
Yeah,
I bet Middle Eastern countries have diversity as our weakness imprinted on their currency, though.
I think
Unity would do great with a coin like that.
Unity is our strength, or something like that. Might be.
That sounds like a great slogan.
This circles back to the conclusion in search of justifying argument. So we start with the assertion that we should rule over this country, and then we find justifying arguments that match our assumptions and our predispositions. So we can arrive at the same conclusion through multiple myriad different mechanisms and methodologies, and that's how one can garner political support from what would theoretically be exactly antagonistic groups, because the left thinks that we should subjugate them because we're more powerful than them. The right thinks we should subjugate them because we're more powerful, and the left thinks we should subjugate them to uplift them. But the conclusion is we need to subjugate them first.
Yeah, no, my point is that both of those are basically the same argument. It's just that the value judgments are slightly different. Whether or not we're doing it because we think that we're better than the natives, or whether we think that the natives deserve better or something.
And that's what I'm talking about when I talk about nebulous nationalists, nebulous ideologies, nebulous goals. As long as you can keep your goal sufficiently nebulous, you don't have to worry about the concrete examples that countermand your argument, that basically destroy the point you're trying to make. Those are just ignored.
I think the question that we should be asking is, why does that transfer take place? Why do you think that people will so easily flip-flop between some of these ideologies?
Well, it's a simple opportunity for them to achieve greater status making that argument than they would making a supporting argument. There's untrammeled ground upon which they can tread in the theory of unconstrained reality. They don't have to have anything gainsaid against their perspective by anyone, because it's all theoretical. It's all something that is never going to happen. So they can set their assumptions and their conclusions in any way they like.
Yeah, well, the argument I've been saying for quite a while is if you make war with reality, then you can you can preach forever, because you're never going to win it. It's never going to finish. But I think that there's also an element with the transfer, particularly from the English context, for a very long time, at least a couple of hundred years, there has been this love of the foreign. And I think that, it's fine in some cases, particularly with some of the art movements that we had. It was just ways of expressing itself in. There was Orientalism in the early 1800s, where a lot of the art style went down that route. It can be a completely acceptable minority of the intelligentsia that have that view. But it really started to take hold, and I think it's part of what we see now, why you have it being acceptable to have a racial supremacy, to categorize one race as superior as long as it's not your own. I feel like there's this out-group bias that is really prevalent now.
It's another set of virtue signaling / identification that one can use that has no cost. It's a way for someone to create, to individuate themselves from the masses for no other reason than individuating themselves from the masses. It gives them an opportunity to stake a claim on fresh ground.
But that's second step, because it's not fresh ground anymore, and it's also it's only virtue signaling at no cost if the common attitude of the country is that is a virtue. So I'm kind of trying to take that one step back and say, where did that switch happen?
So you're saying you don't agree with him that it's masochism and sexual frustration that is the main driving force between towards it.
There is masochism involved in that switchover, and maybe it is some kind of offshoot of Puritanism. I know that argument's been made plenty of times. I don't know, but masochism is definitely involved along the line somewhere. The sexual frustration
seems like a cheap shot, that one.
Yeah, that was kind of an odd one, although he does follow it up with something that with a feeling that is still common today.
Yeah.
It's very Freudian in that sense.
Yes. I'm not going to cover that. People can go read the essay if they want to know what we're referring to.
Well, it's your classic victim ideology and your victimhood. It's you can cast yourself as the victim again without losing anything. And humans are naturally compassionate, especially towards their in-group. So it's an opportunity to prey upon the compassion of their fellow citizens without actually having to undertake anything that's traumatic.
Yeah, no, obviously I completely agree, but I'm trying to figure out why they were classed as the victim group, because there are other victim groups that you could more justifiably use now, but they're not the ones being used.
Because the victim groups they're using are the ones that there's no way to disprove. You can't prove a counterfactual.
But they don't need to be counterfactuals anymore. The victim groups, some of the victim groups they're using, you know, evidence can be provided as to why some of the claims being made.
Are we talking about today, or are we talking about what Orwell was?
I'm talking about now. But that's what I mean. I want to know why that change. If it was just counterfactuals to begin with, when did that change occur? And why, if we now have evidence that the victim groups that are being used aren't quite as oppressed as they're being claimed to be, would they not revert if they rely on the fact that they're using counterfactuals? Does that make sense?
Apparently not.
Yeah, I'm assuming not. What I'm trying to say is that non-reality is an essential part of some of the arguments that they make. So when they have been so effective that reality now reflects the worldview that they're pushing, why would they not then change to a new one that suits the non-reality?
Well, they have. One can see this clearly from the progression of the civil rights. First it was minorities, then it was women, then it was gays, then it was transsexuals.
No, I suppose you're right. Yeah, it's more of a progression along one line than a switching to the other side, which is what we saw previously in the transfer.
I mean, also it kind of gets into one of the overarching issues that he sort of recognizes in at the very start of the essay, which is that he's describing something that he doesn't have a proper term for, but I think the correct term would be some version of idealism that is being dealt with. And so whenever these issues are being dealt with, they're being talked about in more ideal senses rather than, or rather as forms rather than as concrete entities that you can observe on the ground. So there will be, I dare say, there will never be a scenario under the current paradigm where the ethnic minorities are considered to be in a more empowered position than Caucasians, because those are sort of like definitional forms. To be, and they've even gone as far now as to set up whiteness itself as like a superiority category, which has tenuous relationship to the Caucasian
reality.
The Caucasian ethnic groups as observable. Therefore, we're no longer dealing with things that can be sort of statistically measured. We're just talking in terms of pure forms.
Yeah,
and that goes back to that goes back to historical nebulousness of an argument and rhetorical sophistry to support whatever ends one wishes to achieve.
That makes it sound a little bit more cynical than I think it probably is in a lot of these cases, though, because you can talk about in like communist terms. You can talk about the working class as an entity that exists as like a form separate to the actual plight of poor people as we would just sort of see them. And you can very much make the argument, and like if you get into the actual sort of communist arguments, then you can kind of see some of the logic that goes into killing poor people in order to empower the working class. It's perverse, but when you're kind of dealing with that kind of idealism that exists using some of the same terms that we would use to describe empirical entities, but exists parallel to them, you kind of get these weird outcomes. And I think we're talking about basically the same thing here, and experiencing the same thing in the categories of blackness and whiteness.
Well, on that cheerful note, gentlemen, I must depart. I have a conflict.
Okay. Well, thanks for the chat.
Quick, make your point again, so he can't defend himself.
Well, just in summary, ideology is a mechanism for an individual to enshroud oneself with stolen glory or stolen victimhood without having to achieve that glory or suffer the viciousness that would result in them being a victim. So it's an opportunity for midwits to basically jump up in prestige outside of their current paradigm, either by attacking the current paradigm, grabbing onto the glory of the current paradigm, or finding another paradigm to which they can lash their coattails. So, and it's a psychological phenomenon that's been present throughout history. It's just been not, I guess, recognized as clearly until recently, or at least not described as such. And that's why the classic detached clinical assessment of it could be viewed as cynical. It's not cynical. It's just a reality. It's just a way for people to enhance their status at minimal cost.
But many of them seem to be so convinced that there is social cost involved with what they're pursuing. I'm reminded of the actor who played Finn in the Star Wars movies. Can't remember what his name is now, but he seemed to be pretty. John Boyega, that's it. He seemed to be pretty convinced that he was ruining his own career to go and join the Black Lives Matter protests, despite the fact that is the official ideology of the corporate world, effectively.
Indifference to reality is one of his major points.
That's the martyr complex, and it's yet another way of achieving status that may or may not be deserved without having to. I mean, one could accept that. There's Munchausen syndrome and Munchausen syndrome by proxy. Those are also ones where on Munchausen syndrome, individuals take upon themselves bad situations in order to gain status. In Munchausen's by proxy, they have their children or someone else in their care take on those symptoms in order to gain status. It's it's another method for humans to gain status within groups, and I've really got to leave it at that. So I'll listen to the rest of this later. Talk to you later, guys.
So yeah, an example of getting status like that would be talking about the lived experiences of a group. So you say, well, I have forefathers who experienced slavery, and we still have to deal with these lived experiences. And then you go like, yeah, but you didn't live through it, and you live in a country which is way more advanced, and you also have these benefits. But it doesn't matter, because as the cost for them, so the amount of effort that they have to do in order to gain status, when normally you would have to make money, or you have to do a lot of work in order to gain status, or you have to be lucky and be born into it. A cheap way to gain status is to say, well, I'm a victim, instead of I'm a winner. And this is kind of odd, because you would expect that the losers of society would not be somebody who would benefit from that. But apparently there's a way to game the system in order to get ahead of other people.
Let's try and pull it back to the essay. It's been good discussion, but let's if there's anything else to discuss on it, let's try and pull it back.
One thing I liked about the essay was that that Orwell noticed that people are really bad at statistics, which keeps popping up in psychology over and over again. And so even statisticians,
8 out of 10 people.
Yeah, at least 83% of all statistics are made up. But but basically, if a story is plausible, then people will accept it, even if it's improbable. And that's just the way the human mind works. And that's a great way to trick people into thinking, well, okay, we should accept this because it could happen, and why not? And you see this also in Orwell's work. So in an Animal Farm, for example, there are a lot of plausible stories. You don't know if they're true. You don't know if milk actually helps the brains of the pigs, but they still claim it is, and then they use that as a justification for them to take that resource. And because then when people really start to complain, then they say, well, just don't you want the farmer to come back? Don't you want Jones to come back? And then people definitely don't want to. They don't know how probable this is, because Jones might have another job, or has anybody seen him? But it's the plausibility that basically tricks them into doing this. So,
and to loosely tie that into another point that's made in the essay, when he speaks about, I think it's under the indifference to reality section, he speaks about people writing history. He describes, I've got a quote here, which is, much of the propagandist writing of our time amounts to plain forgery. But he describes people trying to put the spirit of what they believe to be the current moral system, or the current nationalism, as he might describe it, into the past, and how they wouldn't even view that as being any sort of editing of the past, because all they're doing is reaffirming what they know to be true and using history as their basis for it. They're saying, it's true in the way in which it's the way that the reader should interpret it is true, even if the historical events they don't matter. It doesn't matter if they're accurate, because the ultimate goal is to make sure that people come out the other end of it with the correct story.
Yeah, that's also what is happening with the statues of all the slave owners. It doesn't matter what their intentions were, or whether what they were doing was considered normal at the time. It is the question: is it normal nowadays? And this tactic has been used over and over again.
Well, it also made me think back to our absolutism discussion, where it doesn't matter whether or not this idea that we have of monarchy being this absolute form of government is true. If we tell everyone, and if we write history in that way, then people will come out with the quote unquote correct opinion of systems of government, because people will come out of it thinking, well, whatever happens, we can't go back to Mr. Jones, or whatever happens, we can't go back to monarchy, because X, Y, and Z. It's going to be it's going to be oppressive. It's going to be whatever. And we can have discussions of whether or not those things are true. But everything is written in this way. And obviously, the biggest one that we have is World War II. It's only just now becoming a possibility to write something that counters some of the narratives that we have. But I think I may have mentioned this on previous discussions. You look at the release of Peter Hitchens' The Phony Victory, and there's still everyone up in arms the minute you even question things that happened in World War II.
It probably has to do with the fact that the generation who has fought in World War II now has passed away. And you also notice that recently people start to realize what the Weimar Republic actually is, because our view of World War II is really tainted by what happened in the end of it. That it did basically after D-Day and the discovery of the camps. But what led up to the whole thing, the 30s, what was happening in Germany, you hardly hear anything about that. That's just becoming more and more. It's being rediscovered nowadays.
Well, there's a vague view that it's kind of like usually a throwaway line that Germany threw off its liberal democracy and replaced it with National Socialism, kind of implying or at least carrying the baggage of what we perceive in the modern day as liberal democracy, and not really necessarily seeing or carrying all the positive connotations of that are seeded from elsewhere, but don't really go into details as to what was actually going on.
And there was also the notion that it was quite strange that they would do that, because why would people take such extreme measures? But now with the current pandemic, we kind of see what was happening. If there's enough higher up saying we should do this, and they have a plausible story, people will do strange things, and they will suddenly start voting in a certain way, and they will start demanding certain things, and.
The term that seems to have fallen out of favor now, but the Overton window, I think, is what they're trying to build up with these narratives, where as long as you have the enemy on the far side of that Overton window, people can have their mini discussions inside of it, because they'll always look outside and think, well, whatever we decide is the correct outcome, at least we know we're not going back to X.
I think Orwell also mentions this, that you could not discuss certain things with the press. So you could write a book which would go against the Soviet Union just after the Second World War, but the press would say, "Oh, it's not a good book," or they would just ignore it. And I think that might be the reason why he decided to turn Animal Farm into a fable instead of just making a straight book about what happened in the Soviet Union, in order to get around this thing where, if you would write something that would go against the narrative, it would be ignored. But if you would turn it into a fairy tale, it might just slip underneath the radar. And the same thing probably for 1984, which is a kind of a science fiction-y novel, even, because it's supposedly be in the far future, not in the current day. What would happen if you would take a certain regime and you would just keep on going in a certain direction?
Yeah, well, the only way to write truth is fiction. That's the old aphorism being thrown around now.
Yeah, but it's a way to get around the Overton window, as it is.
Yeah.
I guess so. I guess the question is then, bringing it back to the essay a little bit, is the ideal that he's setting up of looking at everything much more empirically and just taking the sort of facts as they are and not getting caught up in all of these different biases. I don't necessarily think that this bias that he's just talking about is something that's particularly inescapable. Escapable rather. I think it's basically inescapable, because like the nature of how we have to ingest information and the nature of how our brains have to process information in fairly economical manners. We're kind of always going to be led into the same place. It's just that, I would probably argue that at the time of his writing, the extent to which you can sort of pick and choose your ideology that you want to fall into is much more extensive than it has been at many times in the past. Whereas, prior, it might have been, for the prior century or so, it might have been between liberalism and, some form of traditionalism, or some kind of some vague sort of conservatism. And those were basically your only two options.
But if we're going to pathologize it and summarize it, I think I would say that it is, I agree with you. It's a mindset that is inescapable as being a human. But I do think that there's a benefit to having an essay like this, or, it's funny to draw comparisons, but yeah, something like The Righteous Mind, where you can be aware of it and you can have information to not slip into some of the more tribal thinking, but as long as you know that you're always going to have tribal thinking, and that may not necessarily be a bad thing, because group action in some ways can only occur with some of these more simplistic. I think the Jordan Peterson terms for it was the resolution. If you have a high resolution image of yourself, because you can pick out all of the bits and pieces and you can be more thorough with the understanding, then that's fine. But you can't afford to have a high resolution image of everyone on the planet. There has to be this compression of groups at some stage, and that may not necessarily be a bad thing. I think the conversation that having previously off air about certain state spies, you may want to view them as individual people, but if you do that, then you're more susceptible to provide information or to slip up, and that if let me just say it's China. If you're dealing with a Chinese asset and you view them as just an individual, they're not viewing you that way, so you're always at a disadvantage. So you have to have that sort of group thinking, even if you can know on another level underneath. And if you want to call it double think, then whatever. But you can simultaneously have the knowledge that they're part of an enemy out group, but they're also an individual person.
Yeah, it might be that here in the West we have quite an individualistic view, which is something that actually arose after the Second World War. It's the creed of the baby boomers. They wanted to be individuals, and they all wanted to be noticed and achieve something. And that's something that's not present in every culture. And so it also puts you at a disadvantage, because if you assume that indeed everybody is individualistic like you are, then they can use that to their advantage as it is.
You also have to kind of reject all your brain's decision-making powers that have evolved over millennia. Stereotyping. That's obviously now it's bad to stereotype people. It's good to stereotype your environment, but bad to stereotype people. But things like that, you have to reject them in order to reach this utopian way of thinking that Orwell wants, with this your mind untainted by these polluting ideas.
Well, imagine watching a game of football and viewing everyone on an individual basis. You think, why are some of these people working against each other? Why is there no cooperation between the whole group? Why is this person interacting this way? You have to have an understanding of group action.
Yeah.
Yeah. Without stereotypes, the world would be very difficult to understand, because you would have to process so much information.
Just die very quickly. If your brain couldn't categorize different things around you in the world into different boxes, you just probably walk off a cliff without realizing.
It would be too painful just to exist.
We have to get pimp-pilled.
Well, this is part of my thinking more generally, is that you can't escape the frame in which you're thinking, and the frame is not some kind of completely unbiased frame. It's not some kind of a completely unbiased structure, and so it's just a case of kind of choosing which one you want to go for, and how much you want to manipulate that, I suppose, in a more top-down sense, perhaps. And that sounds pretty bad. I'm aware, but I don't know. It kind of falls into the iron law of oligarchy category of facts to me, where just so many of these things come from the top down anyway. So kind of criticizing them is a little bit pointless and perhaps even destructive.
And it's also not arbitrary. We have these systems of thought for a reason.
Oh yeah, that's certainly helpful.
So by trying to reject it, they're there for a reason. They've got us this far. So
to your point, bloke. If you if you think that you're about to fall off a cliff any moment, you can't see the floor, then you're going to have some problems navigating the world.
You have some basic assumptions you have to basically live with.
Yeah,
So,
and those probably aren't value free. But yeah, sorry, go on.
I just wanted to go back to the essay itself. The whole thing, just my initial sort of thoughts after reading it was, this is just Orwell attacking the intelligentsia of Britain in general, and he's using this kind of wielding the knife of nationalism to slice them up into different pieces.
Yeah, I have to agree that nationalism is maybe not the right word, but it might be something that was prevalent back in the day, especially since at the end of the Second World War, you had this big block, there's a lot of propaganda going towards people identifying with a certain nation in order to justify what they were doing.
But what I mean is that although it's called Notes on Nationalism, nationalism is just the tool he's using.
Yeah.
Whereas, it should really be called Notes on the British Intelligentsia in 1945.
Yeah, well, like I say, I think, as I said at the beginning, I think he's reframing the language to suit his needs. Which,
but it's definitely,
can we be surprised that he's doing that?
It's an interesting cross section of the different beliefs and ideologies within Britain at the time, and scarily enough, how those things have just carried on till the present, without a lot of them without changing. It's like you can see how deep the rot goes. At least we've sliced all the way back to 1945 in this essay, and it's still there. Keep slicing back in time. So,
I think at some point we're talking about the Romans, and then probably at some point you're in ancient Greece, and then it still happens, and then.
So you're saying we should reject modernity?
I'm just saying that this is not a unique process to which is what do you call it, a property of modernity. I think it's just a property of human nature.
Or civilization at certain stages, if you wanted to go down the cyclical history sort of line of thinking. Because certainly at times the Romans were very xenophilic.
Yes. Yeah, I think that maybe I haven't read enough Spengler to know if this is the exact thought process, but when the artistic side of the civilization starts to crystallize, looking at the outside to embrace the artwork from the outside and the civilization of the outside, it may be part of the civilizational cycle. So, anything else to go through, or does that finish it off?
I think I pretty much said my piece. I didn't really, as can probably be inferred from my previous comments, I don't find that much of use in it. I think that what he's aiming for, like the value judgment, is all off basically. I think what he's aiming to do is ultimately destructive, and I don't think a lot of his observations are terribly useful. But it is interesting to see, as you said earlier, that a lot of these trends that we're experiencing at the moment are older than people might think.
It feels like there's a chrysalis of an idea in there that he just never quite finds the fully formed version of.
Well, he's criticizing a form of idealism effectively, and he's criticizing the idealist outcropping, I suppose, in certain ways that people think about things. And this is in part why he has no particular love for Carlyle as basically the only British representative of this idea that he's calling nationalism, but despite it kind of making inroads. Because
that was a particularly cheap shot.
Yeah, well, because Carlyle is one of the only people who tried to bring idealism of the German sense into the sort of Anglo world, effectively the Anglo literary world. So that would be the reasoning there. And for some reason, he just never makes this connection. I don't know if it's because he didn't know, or if it was just because he didn't want to take it there for whatever reason. But
it's just it's a pity that he only lived 5 more years after this, because perhaps over time he would have revisited this and gained a different understanding.
Would have gotten 1984 revisited or write a sequel.
On the plus
1985.
side, on the plus side, maybe it's best. It's like Nirvana. Sometimes it's just best to go out on your peak.
You know
I think Orwell's wife killed him. But Karen.
you know what happens when they start making sequels and prequels. We've seen that. Like sometimes you just let it be with the original.
1983. I can't wait to see 1983.
1958. He'd write it in 84 and do a prequel.
Well, I was thinking, 2048 would be the good time to write a sequel to 1984, and then set it in 2084.
Right, before we carry on down this road, I'm going to wrap this up then. Any final thoughts?
Nothing really has changed over the ages.
Do you advise that people read it, or should they skip over this one?
It's kind of interesting, but if you already read a lot of political history, then there might not be so much new stuff in it.
It's a fairly short read, so may as well give it a look, even if it's just to sort of criticize it.
He's a good writer, I think. So I think it has some entertainment value as well.
Yeah, whatever he's writing about, he is very easy to read. I've always found.
The main effect this essay seems to have on people is that they just start using the term patriotism more often than nationalism, like the ones who agree with it. Because at the start he kind of frames, patriotism is good and nationalism is bad, and his
bad.
Well, I mean that could be part of the sort of word games again, I suppose, because in terms of what patriotism actually means, it's sort of love or championing of one's country as a place, rather than championing of one's people as a nation, and that's the big no-no after the 40s.
Yeah, that was I know we were trying to close up, but I think that we. Just before we finish, I think that might be something to just quickly mention is I think the reason that language games are being played is because it is moving the Overton window so that all of the description is in the framework of using the term nation, and it takes you away from something that was a bit more loyalty or fealty based, which, as you say, is a big no-no at the beginning of the 20th century onwards. So. Right, let's finish off. In a couple of weeks' time, we will be doing the death penalty, an article by Peter Hitchens. So join us then. We have iTunes Eye back with us, and I think he's going to prepare some slides because it's an area of expertise of his. And other than that, see you next time. Is anyone going to say goodbye?
Yeah, sure. Goodbye.
Say goodbye.
Bye.